talk about what I think are some powerful intuitions, critical intuitions that we take from Marx and Engels. And I say we take because I think they are part of the broad vocabulary of discontent and criticism of capitalism. I want, though, to explore what I think are some philosophical tensions at the root of Marx and Engels. So I'm not going to take a stand on any of the many issues around the feasibility of socialist programs inspired by a Marxist framework, whether Marx provides compelling critical vocabulary and framework for cultural analysis or economics and social analysis more broadly. All important and interesting questions that are raging still today. But again, we're encountering Marx and Engels as a part of these strands of Enlightenment thought and European thought more broadly. And while extraordinarily influential, I really want to focus on them as philosophical moments in these continuing debates about ideas and their importance, their nature, their relevance. And I want to highlight what I take to be, again, a direction that I think Marx and Engels inherit from Hegel, and show that some of the critical intuitions that I think are so powerful in Marx and Engels can be addressed, but in a way that takes seriously what I think are important philosophical omissions. And in laying that out, I'm going to echo the strategy of internal critique that Kierkegaard levels against Hegel, but instead of talking about faith, I'm going to talk about ethics as a vital part of the human experience that seems to be dissolved or dissipated and ignored in the method that Marx and Engels take from Hegel. To show you an alternative pathway, I'll then turn to Mill's utilitarianism, and we'll say a few things also about his On Liberty, and then show how some of the tensions in On Liberty that are also in utilitarianism are echoed in a rather brilliant, creative, and unsettling critical stance towards the entire Enlightenments that we find in Friedrich Nietzsche. One of the features of Hegel's response to Kant is a dissolution of an important dimension of Kant's project. So let me introduce that thought by quoting a passage, paraphrasing a passage early in the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant remarks that the things that increasingly fill him with awe and wonder are when he looks to the starry heavens above and the moral law within. And both of those components are vital for Kant's project, which I and others have described as recovering some space for an account of human freedom against an increasingly deterministic, mechanistic, and universal story of nature, its natural laws, its causal processes and mechanisms. So when Kant says these two things fill him with awe and wonder, I mean, he's thinking just how extraordinary it is that we have this story unfolding of the natural world. And he's thinking in particular of Newton and Leibniz, Newton and Laplace. The story about the laws that govern nature. But he also thinks when we look within us, we see this capacity to reflect on the moral law that, again, is a space of human freedom. It defines what's distinctive about us. It separates us from our natural impulses in a way that he thinks makes Hume's account an unsatisfying story about our ethical life. And so much of Kant's project reflects these dual aims, but they're carried on as he thinks properly philosophical projects. They're not empirical, they're not scientific, they're processes of pure reason reflecting on itself. So we have the story about human knowledge, about how we gain knowledge about the world, how we can gain knowledge that's new knowledge, but that isn't the input of sensory experience. It's just reason reflecting. And when we do that, we discover these pure intuitions that shape our subsequent knowledge of the world, our intuitions of sort of spatial structure, of causal relations, of permanence and extension of substance through time and space. And that gives us a story about our own coherence as identities, even as our bodies change, our thoughts and our understandings change. But we understand that there's an underlying coherence to our identity. And we discover that not through our sensory impressions, but through reasoning. Discovering these pure intuitions. And we use those are then used to construct our knowledge of the world. But our knowledge of the world is always mediated. It's always a constructive project. We never have this direct, unmediated experience of the world. Like, even when I hit myself here, I sort of think, oh, I'm real. But even those sensations are being sent to my brain and interpreted and structured by my cognition. Again, and structured against that pure intuition of some underlying coherence to my identity, even as I think, wow, you know, my body's different than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Even the cells are just, you know, the constant process of what one scholar, 70s, I think, called autopoiesis, where this dynamic, coherent thing, but it's never the same material. It's always changing. And yet, you know, I construct my self-knowledge of that changing dynamic against that underlying coherence. And so that's a story about how we gain knowledge of the world and ourselves. And then similarly, we can reflect on pure intuitions about morality, and we can discover this idea of a categorical imperative that binds us unconditionally and is such that anyone reflecting, divorced from experience, from particular interests and aims and goals, from our particular relationships and circumstances, we could reason what a universal moral law would be for them in this kingdom of ends, as Kant calls it. And he thinks that law would have the property of respecting us as ends in ourselves, never as mere means, because we have a dignity precisely because we have this capacity for reflection on the moral law, reflecting on a moral law that we will then bind ourselves to, and that capacity for rational moral agency gives us a dignity, a value beyond price. And so whatever a moral law is, the maxim that we affirm as unconditionally binding, of universal scope, universally accepted by rational agents in this noumenal realm of this kingdom of ends, it will respect us all as having that dignity, as bearers of dignity. Now, Hegel, when he responds to Kant, I think it's fair to say, by and large, he's responding to that first part of the project, the epistemic constraints, that I suppose, the epistemic thesis that suggests a kind of metaphysical restraint, that we can never have unmediated, direct experience, knowledge of the world as it is, as it really is. And that's what Hegel thinks we can overcome through philosophy properly conducted. The world appears rational to us upon reflection, not because we construct the world according to those pure intuitions that reason discovers. It's not a constructivist thesis, Hegel suggests, to say the world is rational. It really is rational. That's why it appears rational to us. And so as we seem to be constructing knowledge, what we actually discover is it was there all along, this unmediated unity of reason in the world, of ideas as this fundamental stuff. And so we overcome this epistemic thesis that Kant asserts by recognizing that we were in this unmediated reciprocal relationship with pure reason, consciousness as freedom, all along. It was just unfolding. And so this reconciliation of this universal abstract concept of the idea with the particular instantiations of it in the world, our individual bounded, limited, embodied consciousness. And so we overcome this tension between mind and body, between nature and spirit, between substance and mind, by reconciling through our comprehension this process of the unfolding of reason in the world. And Now, again, even today, I'm sort of tempted just to think that's just so much babble, philosopho-babble. I doesn't mean to overcome this tension by recognizing that the idea becomes manifest as the reconciliation of the particular and the abstract, the universal and again, it sounds like a weird theological process, linguistic game. But whatever you think of it, whether you agree with me that it seems kind of weird and ultimately kind of just playing with words, or if you think, no, there's something to this. Either way, the only thing I want to draw your attention to here is that second realm that Kant talked about looking into our souls and looking into us and discovering the moral law within, that seems to have dissolved as well. And while it's true that Hegel talks about ethics, he talks about property, he talks about right, he has a philosophy of right, I think when he says things like, the state is the actuality of the ethical idea, it's actuality and idea that are doing a lot of the work in that phrase, not ethics. Ethics is a part of this unfolding of reason in the world. And again, whatever you think about the metaphysical status of that thesis, notice that it's not recognizing those two realms that Kant asserted. This is the realms of nature and the realm of moral reasoning. And it's not that those two things can't be interrelated, but they're importantly distinct as philosophical subjects and have to be treated as such, Kant thought. And Hegel has kind of dissolved that. The ethical just emerges along as part of this unfolding of consciousness in the world. And so what we thought were ethical claims about property, where we abstracted and thought, what is a rule of property? But then we're confronted with these particular instances of property manifest in our bodily possessions and our material work in the world. That resolves itself into this state that reconciles those particular manifestations with the abstract principle. And so insofar as those abstract principles involve ethics, those are just moments in this historical unfolding, this historical process. Now, again, even as I say that, I don't know what to make of it as a metaphysical claim, but all I want to emphasize yet again, is that Kant's project importantly distinguished between these epistemic considerations and ethics, moral reasonings per se. It's not that they weren't related, they were importantly distinct. They were different kinds of enterprises. Now, that draw on the same rational methods of reflecting on pure intuition, but we don't imagine that they can be collapsed. We don't imagine there'd suddenly be a natural law dictating the science of ethics. Now, Marx and Engels are frustrated with the German idealists who follow Hegel. They want to flip Hegel on his head, view him from a camera obscura, which means they don't want to explain the origins of consciousness through the evolution of the development of ideas. They don't think that life emerges from sort of consciousness as the unfolding of ideas. They think that consciousness emerges from life as a rooted, grounded material phenomenon. So rather than explaining all of these things as the unfolding of ideas, they want to explain all these things like property, the dimensions of politics, institutions. They want to explain that as the unfolding of material processes and the relations, the social relations that grow up around those material processes of production, which are at a very basic level about staying alive. So they too see a kind of nature, human freedom distinction. Their idea of species being, this awkward English translation of a comparably awkward German phrase, the species part of that phrase refers to those material processes and needs, our biological rootedness in the world. But the species being idea is that we can reflect on us being a member of a species that has this material basis, and we can understand that basis in a way that other social animals, for instance, they argue, cannot. Bees build these inordinately complex structures and have these social hierarchies and elaborate social differentiation of tasks. But that's all kind of instinctively coded. bees don't step back and reflect on it and say, oh, look at this, look at these elaborately designed sort of structures that reflect how we evolved as a social species. No, they just do it. But humans don't just do it. In addition to just doing it, eating, sleeping, reproducing, we can reflect on that. We can learn more about our history and our biology. We can resist that in the way Rousseau thought, glimmerings of freedom. We can try and create in the world. In fact, we're at our most human, they think, the being part of species being, when we are being in the world as creators, as artists, as putting ourselves in the world as a kind of objective, real expression of our will, of our creativity, of our identity, and we build things, even when we don't have to. So in Marx and Hegel, then, we do see an idea of human freedom as creativity and expression in the world beyond simple material need. What we're lacking here, though, is any vocabulary and corresponding argument that makes sense of that freedom as a moral good or as a moral process or moral phenomenon. It has something to do with our distinctiveness, but it's still very much sort of predicated on those material processes. And by the time we get to the Communist Manifesto, certainly Capital, this is a story of the evolution of tensions in material processes and the relations, the social relations around those productive practices and processes. And as those tensions unfold, so too do those relations as they transform. And then we end up eventually with this simplification of the relations of production into two distinct classes, one that owns the means of production, directly controls it, and the other that only really can be said to own their labor, their bodies, their labor, and can sell, or depending how you structure it, rent, can give their labor power to the owners of the means of production in exchange for wages. But notice in that story of the unfolding of the revolution, in the Communist Manifesto, all of a sudden there's not really a role for that creative human agency. There's a story about how once this historical process unfolds and the proletariat revolts and claims the means of production with the bourgeoisie, right? This becomes a classless society in which we all control the means of production. And then we can exercise that freedom. Remember, we can fish in the morning, we can be carpenters in the afternoon, and poets and critics in the evening. But there's no story about how that freedom was implicated in the processes that brought about the conditions for that freedom. That's the sense in which I think Schumpeter was right to recognize that this has a kind of religious feel to it, right? This is a kind of eschatological story, to invoke some theological jargon. It's a story about the ends and the final ends and the kingdom of God. But here, it's the kingdom of post-capitalist freedom, where we all together provide for our material needs so we can do whatever we want in life. And we're not locked into, by the division of labor and wages, into a particular set of productive practices that determine who and what we are. And they lock us in. So I will say, I think the intuition behind that account of freedom is quite attractive. But it's attractive insofar as it's driven by a kind of moral unease with some system that, just by its very structure, involves a systematic controlling discipline, the domination, if you will, of one group, who are then exploited to provide for the affluence and privileges of another. And we think that those systems of dependence and exploitation strike us as problematic. But weirdly, Marx and Engels don't give us a moral vocabulary to give voice to that intuition. We just sort of get that, yeah, there's something weird about that. This James Taylor song, The Mill Worker, and it recounts the story of this young girl growing up in, I'm trying to think, it's upstate New York or upstate Ohio there, and just reflecting as she's working in this dead-end mill job, just how her life went, right? She was playing on the farm. Your dad was a farmer. Her grandfather was a sailor. The storms out on Lake Erie. But then somehow she marries some deadbeat who drinks himself to death, and she has 3 kids to feed and lives in this modest apartment in Massachusetts somewhere, working in this mill. And there's this passage in the song: mill work ain't easy, mill work ain't hard, mill work ain't nothing but a goddamn boring job. So I ride home in the evening, staring at my hands, swearing by my sorrow that a young girl ought to stand a better chance. And that intuition is what gives force to that idyllic vision in the German ideology, and why we want to believe the structural scientific explanation in the Communist Manifesto. But nothing in that structural explanation of the unfolding logic of capitalism gives us a moral vocabulary to describe why we think it's wrong that people are kept by these social structures and just fated by their socioeconomic class into a particular life that, it's not hard, it's not easy, it's just boring as hell, and this is how I put food on the table, and I didn't really, did I choose it? Did I have it? I don't know. A certain kind of response to this is, of course we all have choice. She could have studied harder, or she could have, I don't know, made different choices. But have you ever grown up in like a small town, a small farming town, certainly in the 50s? That's a weird thing to say to someone who has found her life unfold this way. And it's just, I've been nickeled and dimed by the people who keep me at these wages, and I could go to school at night, and this kind of Horatio Algiers story I could try, maybe. I guess the frustration people intuitively feel with these kind of stories is that for every one of those Horatio Algiers stories that does sort of work late at night and find, the opportunities to make more money and to get a better job and to improve themselves, the deck is stacked against that. And so to promote that as like, well, look, you can do better in life than just that mill worker. But the system is systematically stacked against it. It makes it hard for you to do that. And we're sort of going to ask, well, why is it stacked that way? Does it have to be stacked that way? And those are the kind of questions I think you sort of feel compelled to ask. But all I want to emphasize here is that while subsequent literatures that were either called Marxist or informed by Marxism do take these sorts of moral questions quite seriously, there are no moral resources, I think, in Marx and Engels themselves to give voice to this unease. And what's, I think, especially striking is that in later Marx and Engels, these moral frameworks, these ethical questions, would be dismissed as just epiphenomenal, false consciousness, if you will. They're just the sort of thing you believe when you're in the ruling class, or the things you're sort of been tricked into believing when you're not in the privileged class. And so the kind of story we would tell about why things could be different than this, young woman just having to live her life feeding 3 kids because her deadbeat husband drank himself to death and she was stuck at the mill. And we struggle with a way to analyze that. So is it her fault? I mean, did she have a choice? Could we structure things so that those workers would have more choice? And it's odd that the system of thought that illuminates this feature of industrial capitalism doesn't give us the moral vocabulary to make sense of it. And if anything, tells us that any moral vocabulary that does make sense of it, either justifying it or criticizing it, is simply a reflection of the ideas of the ruling or the ruled classes. So this idea of false consciousness in Marx seems to suggest that even if you have a moral story for why it's wrong that someone gets locked into this career path from early on in life and didn't really have much say over it. The odd Horatio Algiers story, success story aside, by and large, the decks are stacked against them as surely as they are in a casino, right? And you don't You don't challenge the ways in which casinos are stacked in favor of the house by saying, yeah, but look what someone won. It's like, imagine if, though, it wasn't a casino, you had a choice of entering to throw your money away. It was life, the lottery of life. And you just happened to be born in that small Ohio village to a farmer and just happen to have the kind of neighborhood where you'd fall in with the kind of guy who leaves you hanging with 3 kids, stuck in a dead-end job. And to answer that, to say, yeah, but it's like the casino, right? Here's someone who was in the same circumstances that pulled himself up by their bootstraps. And say, the deck's still stacked against you. The house still always wins. The capitalists still hold the cards, the winning cards. This is Leonard Cohen's song, right? The poor stay poor, the rich get rich. It's a loaded game. Everybody knows. The theoretical framework that made that so clear can't actually let you say, and it's wrong, or and we could do it a different way. Then I think that's a puzzle, and it's a philosophical puzzle. We have to figure out what is it about the theory that led us there. And I think my view of this is it traces back to the way Hegel replied to Kant. That distinctive sphere of ethical questions sort of dissolved away into this teleological logic of history. And Marx and Engels, for all that they reject the idealism that comes out of Hegel, they keep the underlying dialectical logic. And that's the engine that gives them that structural account of history and denies a place for a distinctively moral kind of agency. So that's where I think the tension is. I think it's in how Marx and Engels adopt the Hegelian dialectical logic of tension and unfolding of tensions through the development of these, in Hegel, ideas, in Marx and Engels, in these structural forces. But when they do that, again, they don't give us a moral vocabulary and a moral framework. And you might just say, as some Marxists did, that's not a bug, it's a feature. That moral vocabulary is just more ways to justify prevailing divisions of power, prevailing structures of politics that to support the current relations of production, which sustain the ruling class in its privileged position. But I would throw up against that rejoinder a response that is basically Kierkegaard's response to Hegel, which is, even if you believe that, it seems weird to deny something that's such a powerful part of the human experience, to just try and dissolve it away. It's hard to see how that makes your theory complete when people still experience those leaps of faith, those puzzles of faith. To just explain it away doesn't really speak to the person who's experiencing that puzzle of faith. Now, whatever you think of that answer that would become the existentialist answer to Hegel, consider it as a response to Marx and Engels, where we replace faith for the experience of ethical dilemmas. Now I think it's a much stronger argument, because the experience of an ethical dilemma cries out for a prescriptive rule. It demands that we have an answer to the question, what should I do? Especially in hard cases. Now, think of it let's go back to that Humean inflected evolutionary narrative that explains away morality as in terms of evolutionary psychology and so population genetics. It just says, look, some strategies are deeply linked to heritable traits, and the ones that survive are the ones that help us work together in a group. And morality is just the precipitate of that evolutionary process. Suppose that's true, and suppose we accept that evolutionary psychology theory, or that sort of evolutionary biological explanation of naturalizing morality as the result of evolution. But again, I have this power that Rousseau and Marx and Hegel identify. I can reflect on that biological story, and I can say, oh, hey, I think that's true. I think that's right. I think that is. And now I understand it. Now suppose I could reason in this way and find a way to cheat the evolved norm. And I think, well, I think I will cheat. And I think I'm smart enough that I can make it appear to all of you that I'm obeying the norm, but really behind your back, I'm cheating. I'm violating the norm. And you say to me, you shouldn't do that. I say, why not? I mean, isn't the power to rationally reflect on our biological imperatives, the norms that have evolved, isn't my power to subvert that norm in a clever way also a part of evolution? I mean, just because I'm smarter than you and can see a way to cheat the norm and trick everyone, why does it suddenly make it wrong to exploit you and to exploit that obvious weakness in the norm? And it seems to me, if you're true to this Humean concessive naturalist view, all you can really say is, well, don't get caught. You don't have a defense, a way to say to me, no, it's wrong. You shouldn't do that. I said, well, why not? I can do it and I can get away with it. And your only answer seems to be a prudential, yeah, but what if you get caught? It's like, I'm too smart to get caught. And now you just sort of have to concede that, well, yeah, you're pretty smart. Well, that's a weird moral theory that basically says to us, you shouldn't violate a norm that's evolved because of the consequences. And I say, yeah, but look, I can actually get away with it in a way that has good consequences for me. And it's not that bad for you guys. Besides, you'll never really know. And your answer, it seems to me, has to be, oh yeah, well, nice work if you can get it. I mean, what grounds do you have for affirming the norm as a moral rule? You don't. And so you really don't have an answer to me what I should or shouldn't do. All you can do is keep describing the process that I concede. I understand. That is the biology, the neurobiology of norm compliance. But now I'm smart enough, I've figured out a way to violate the norm without being detected. And your only answer to me seems to be to say, but the norm was good in evolutionary terms. And I don't deny that. I'm just looking after myself. So it seems weird to think that we don't need some story that explains the moral importance of some rules. And Kant understood that. He said, yeah, morality has to be something different than just explaining instinct and evolution. Because he understood that morality, what made us distinctive, is our capacity to be self-ruling, to say, no, I understand I could do a little better by cheating, but I just think it's important to follow this moral rule because it respects all my fellow participants, their dignity, by not treating them as a mere means to my end. So whatever you think about that Kantian solution, recognize that it's a solution to a moral problem. It doesn't think you can dissolve away the moral problem. It tries to give us guidance when moral guidance is needed. And we lose that, I think, when Marx and Engels adopt this Hegelian dialectic, because in the same way that the Humean evolutionary psychologist tries to dissolve away morality by explaining a natural process, the Marxist approach tries to explain away morality by explaining the underlying logic in the evolution of the means of production and the relations of production. In both cases, they think they've dissolved away ethics by explaining it in terms of either biological processes or class relations and material circumstances. But in both cases, they don't have an answer when I say, well, what should I do? Now, either you think you don't need an answer to that, which again, you can just double down and say, that question doesn't even make sense. Or you could just try to recover the good things in these theories, but actually provide an answer to the question asked, what should I do? And I think that's what John Stuart Mill provides, a recognition that that ethical question needs an answer, or you're just going to concede natural differences and describe them as morally worthy inequalities, knowing that moral part of your phrase is really doing no work except deceiving people into thinking that my trickery is actually virtuous. Anyway, you could live like that, but I think Mill is right that there's something about our experience in being free in the sense that we can understand our natural processes and we can act against them. And that freedom calls out for something distinctive, a set of moral prescriptions that tell us how to live our lives. that we can argue about. We don't have to agree on them, but we can't just dissolve them away by pretending that they're problems about the evolution of capitalism or the evolution of cooperation in social organisms. There's a distinctive puzzle here that we've got to address. It can't be sidestepped. And Mill, I think, recognizes that. And he recognizes it in ways, again, that I think will take seriously what Marx and Engels emphasize, this importance of production and creativity in the world, of producing in the world even when we don't need to. It'll take that seriously, but it won't then give us this story about the evolution of capitalism in which that creative agency really has no play. It's just these deep structures, the logic of capitalism unfolding. Now, when Marx talks about alienation, about what's really problematic under capitalism, is the way that when I put my labor into the world, someone else takes it, gives me back a wage, but then keeps a surplus value from my labor in the form of profits when they exchanged my product on the market. And so my labor power goes into producing their commodity using their instruments of production, their factory. It's then sold on a market for a price, and the capitalist has an interest in maximizing the price and minimizing my wage, increasing that differential, that surplus that they extract from it, and then giving me back only a part of the labor value I put into that commodity in the form of wages. And again, I think what troubles us about that is the sense that I'm being exploited in a way, that I'm in a relationship of dependence and I'm being used as a means to someone else's end, crass end of just further affluence without any consideration of my ends. So that Kantian idea of dignity is lurking in this Marxist story, and it cries out for a kind of, some story about it being unfair or being immoral. And yet Marx's own framework, Marx and Engels, can't tell us why it's wrong. They just say it's unsustainable, that the logic of capitalism, that will result in revolution. It's a scientific story they're telling, in Marx's view. So what I think Mill can provide us with in his utilitarianism is a way to take seriously these intuitions as moral intuitions. And to see how he does that, let's turn to think about what Mill is up to. Mill, a remarkable figure, he was never an academic. He has a long family of sort of political nobility, a kind of political aristocracy. James Mill was his father. He had a horrific education. He was, these utilitarians had these ideas about how to educate their children. He was reading Greek and Latin, I think, at like ages 6 and 8, or he's this insanely regimented, brutal child upbringing, and Mill eventually had a nervous breakdown. He recovered. What's striking is the sense of kind of humanity in his utilitarianism. He had a long-standing friendship and intimate relationship with Harriet Taylor, who pulled him towards far greater awareness of the kind of issues we first encountered with Wollstonecraft. And for much of his life, Mill was a strong advocate for universal suffrage and rights of women in 19th century England and Commonwealth. So he led a remarkable life. He was an economist as much as a statesman and philosopher. He was certainly sympathetic to these elements of Marxism that I'm drawing out that I say seem intuitively important, yet we don't have in Marxism a moral vocabulary to describe that importance. And I think there's some debate over, was he a socialist? I think he was. He had socialist leanings. His work in economics on principles of political economy certainly emphasize elements that would become central to socialist economics. But I think he was skeptical of communism and the idea of a communist revolution that would result in a command economy. I think he shared the skepticism of many of what would become the Austrian school that made heroic demands on the capacity of human reason to plan these intricate production chains and commodity production profiles. I think Mill would have been deeply skeptical of the idea of a command economy, and was. But he certainly recognized, again, the intuitive unease people felt with the social contours of 19th century industrial capitalism, just the treatment of the working class, and the poverty and squalor of working class families that seemed to be just maintained by these unrelenting routine labor and very low wages. It just couldn't get out of these poverty traps. And Mill was very sensitive to that. But in the first instance, when we're encountering him in utilitarianism, I think he's best read as trying to recover this distinctive sphere for ethics against its dissolution and weakening under the Marxist program. And he's taking on Kant. He says early in utilitarianism, a test of right and wrong must be the means, one would think, of ascertaining what is right and wrong, not a consequence of having already ascertained it. So he's going to reject both a kind of Humean induction from sentiment and habit, but he's also going to reject this Kantian pure intuitionist approach. And the things he says about Kant are quite striking. Let's read this passage. In essence, what we want then is ethics as a kind of practical art for morals and legislation. And he thinks that utilitarianism is the only game in town, really, for this, for a practical theory of what we ought to do that gives us solutions for the hard cases in particular. He says of this, I might go much further and say to all those a priori moralists, Kant and his followers, who deem it necessary to argue at all, utilitarian arguments are indispensable. It is not my present purpose to criticize these thinkers, but I cannot help referring for illustration to a systematic treatise by one of the most illustrious of them, The Metaphysics of Ethics by Kant. This remarkable man, whose system of thought will long remain one of the landmarks in the history of philosophical speculation, does, in the treatise in question, lay down a universal first principle as the origin and ground of moral obligation. It is this: so act that the rule on which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings. He's translating this himself. He reads in like 6-7 languages. But when he begins to deduce from this precept any of the actual duties of morality, he fails almost grotesquely to show that there would be any contradiction, any logical, not to say physical, impossibility in the adoption by all rational beings of the most outrageously immoral rules of conduct. All he shows is that the consequences of their universal adoption would be such that no one would choose to incur. So it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's a refutation of Kant. It's a clever sort of presentation of his view as the only game in town, and suggesting that Kant, while he's right to recognize that the sphere of moral considerations is distinct, it's not unrelated to the sphere of nature and consequence, but it's distinct. But Kant hasn't actually given us useful moral rules. What he's done is he's invoked this power of human reason to reflect on what morality is, and then supposed that it would straightforwardly follow from having understood what morality is that we would know what to do. So I think what Mill's up to here is he's suggesting that Kant's not playing the right game. I need an account of morality that doesn't just give me a general theory of what morality is. I need it to give me specific guidance in specific tasks for which I need that tool or that cluster of tools. And so the tasks here are most obviously moral dilemmas. And the toolkit is going to involve some kind of ethical prescription that gives me guidance. To quote the philosopher John Rawls, it gives me guidance when guidance is required, especially when the way isn't clear, when I really don't know what to do. Think back to the trolley car experiment, the thought experiment, right? Remember, the trolley car is careening out of control, and you're in a position where you can throw a switch. And if you throw a switch, you kill the worker on a side track, but you save the 10 people on the trolley. If you don't do anything, the worker is safe, but the 10 people in the trolley die. And this is a moral dilemma precisely because simply reflecting on what is the categorical imperative and what does it require me to do in these kind of situations, it doesn't give me an answer what to do here. I mean, partly because any ways in which I could frame this as a universal law that respects us as ends in ourselves, never as mere means, doesn't seem to solve a problem. If I use that argument and think, well, I can't use the worker as a mere instrument to save these people's lives, because then I'm using him as a mere means to their ends. So I don't do anything, the worker lives, but then it seems hard to resist the interpretation that my inaction has resulted in 10 people's deaths, then being used as means to one person's ends, which is surviving as a a bearer of moral dignity. Didn't those people have moral dignity? So it's a tragic choice, and the categorical imperative doesn't seem to tell me what to do. And I think more, obviously Mill isn't giving us the trolley car problem, but that comes much later. Philippa Foot, delightful paper, and I think Judith Jarvis Thompson, that's a version. But Philippa Foot is, I think, the classic statement of the trolley car. But it's a moral dilemma. It demands that we have some. What do we do? Do I do nothing? Do I throw the switch? If I don't do anything, I've still done something. And I think this is a clear illustration of the kind of case that Mill thinks we need a theory of ethics to tell us something about. Mill's utilitarianism means to provide that kind of theory. Guidance where guidance is desperately required. But as a utilitarian, he's not insensitive to, again, the virtues of some of these formulations of the categorical imperative is grounded in human dignity. The importance in Marx and Engels of kind of, dignity in work, a kind of sense that we're not just cogs in a machine being exploited for the wealthy industrialists can become more wealthy. The poor stay poor, the rich get rich. That's a problem. And so Mill is going to give us a way to solve these hard ethical problems that also takes seriously these intuitions and gives us a moral framework within which to argue for them, not simply to assert them as either a part of nature or a part of the deep logic of the evolution of capitalism. So how is he going to do that? He's going to do that by framing utilitarianism in a way that takes these ideas seriously and kind of organizes and prioritizes them. So let's think about what he means by utility. He's a consequentialist, but that means we have to think about what are the consequences we think worthy and the ones we want to avoid. He's a utilitarian in how he formulates his consequentialism. So we have to think about what utility is. Mill famously describes utility not in a kind of base hedonistic sense. It's not simply a calculus involving bodily physical pleasures and physical pains. We don't sort of add them up. And at times, Bentham sometimes used to sound like that. He sounded as if he actually had this idea that we could measure physiological states in the brain of happiness and physiological states of pain and structure policy, according to this metric and the calculus involved in this metric. That's not Mill's view. Mill, as he famously puts it, is talking about utility in the largest sense, grounded in our permanent interests as progressive beings. What does he mean by that? Well, I think he means something like this idea of dignity in Kant, and something like the importance of kind of creative agency in the world that we find in Marx and Engels in the German ideology. He has this vision, I think, of us living lives where our happiness sometimes involves some pain. Sometimes think about just going to the gym. Anytime you're working out, it's like if we're simply guided by short-term, immediate pleasure and pain, sort of physical pleasure or physical pain, probably none of us would work out. None of us would do any activity that required a degree of sort of discipline and resolve and exercise and training. And yet we do it. Why do we do it? Because we think there's something about these projects that brings us a kind of deeper happiness. We might not even frame it that way. We might actually say, no, we're actually quite unhappy. Think about philosophers are constantly questioning everything, and they're challenging their own beliefs. Perhaps hard with having friendships because you're challenging your friends' beliefs. Socrates, was it a happy life? Well, yes, in this Millian sense. It may not have always been a satisfying life. It might have sometimes deep emotional strain and stress, and eventually being put to death by his fellow citizens. These are sources of some pain and dissatisfaction. But as Mill famously puts it, it's better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And if the pig thinks differently, it's because he hasn't really enjoyed the kind of higher quality pleasures that Socrates enjoys, even as he seems frustrated and dissatisfied. So this is going to answer the hedonist objection that utilitarians ultimately just are concerned with bodily pleasure and bodily pain. No. Happiness has these elements that are tied to distinctively human powers of reasoning and moral and aesthetic enjoyment and discernment, and a truer, a genuine account of happiness will take those into account. But how do we identify them? And I'll give you an example that just is important in my life, even though I suck at it. Surfing. In the 80s or 90s in Hawaii, there was one of the state senators famously had this passage where there will be no parasites in paradise. And he was thinking of the surfers. These people would come, they'd basically live on the beach, just hanging out, surf all day into the night. Hawaii has a Canada-like healthcare system, quite generous social support. So the idea was you don't come to Hawaii to enjoy our generous healthcare and welfare supports and not contribute and just sit on the beach surfing. And yeah, that's a popular image of surfers, right? The surf bum makes stupid life choices just to surf. But then the surfer might respond to you and say, actually, what I'm doing is a lot more like what an artist does, or a monk when they meditate. We're actually attaining a kind of stillness, introspection, and a sense of oneness with nature in all its awe and majesty and power that has an aesthetic value. It's almost, I won't say beyond price, but its value is not simply that it's a hedonistic pleasure because I just take physical pleasure in this and oh, it's cool. No, I'm an artist. The waves are my tapestry. The board is my instrument. And what do you say to that surfer? It's like, do you just say, no, you're wrong, you're a bum? And so there are a lot of human activities that might on the face of it seem like base physical pleasure. And yet, as humans, we bestow on that activity a depth of meaning that sounds more like art. It sounds more like poetry. And we don't want to dismiss them as mere base pleasures, saying, oh no, the artists, the musician, the poet, they're basically doing what I do when I eat junk food or when I post angry rants online. There's nothing more to it than that. It's just base physical pleasure they get from expressing themselves. We feel there's something missing in that account of the arts. And that's what Mill kind of wants to glom onto here. Is like, if you think there's something to this idea that reasoning about morality, reasoning about philosophy, reasoning about art, and actually doing these things, if you think that's important, then your calculus of pleasure and pain have to take that into account. You need a sophisticated metric that takes that into account. But still, we're still left with the measurement problem. It's like, how do I know what's a higher quality pleasure? You say I'm a bum because I like surfing. I say, no, it's a deeper expression of oneness with nature. And it's an aesthetic, almost religious experience. And so Mill says the way we do it mirrors that quip about Socrates and the pig. If the pig thinks, no, the base bodily pleasures are great, Socrates is overrated. It's because they've never really enjoyed the Socratic pleasures of the mind. And so he thinks we appeal to what he calls competent judges. And these are people who have had the opportunity to experience a wide range of pleasures, the two pleasures in question say, and they're susceptible, roughly equal measure, to these different kinds of pleasures. And by susceptibility, he means they're able to really enjoy them the way that the true advocate enjoys them. So it's not just that some aesthete gets on a surfboard, gets beat up by the waves and said, this is stupid. They have to put the time and effort into learning how to surf and to really getting to that level where they can understand the experience. And then they make the assessment. Then they decide whether it's a higher or a lower quality pleasure. And But I want to emphasize this isn't an aristocratic, Burkean, or perfectionist, elitist understanding. His view of the economy, the sense in which he embraced certain socialist themes in his economics, was geared towards this hope that we could all rise to the standard where we would have enough leisure and enough resources to become educated and traveled and experience a wide range of pleasures in life. And then we all could be these competent judges. But until we got to that point, until we really understood this value, then no, we have to be able to identify these judges who do have that opportunity and ability, and we trust them, so we believe what they say. It's blind trust, but the idea is that, we're not just trusting anyone. We're trusting the people who we think have this competence, this deeper competence. For Mill, he thinks this understanding of utility in terms of higher quality pleasures actually justifies much more freedom than you might at first think. Because the more we're free to live our own lives, to develop and learn and to explore what we might call different pathways to happiness, different experiments in living, as Mill puts it, the more we're free to encounter debates about truth and falsehood by sincerely committed proponents, the richer our lives, the more of these higher quality pleasures we enjoy, and so the greater the aggregate sum of happiness. So you don't want to restrict people's freedom according to some dominant ideology or according to some dominant understanding of freedom, say, as the freedom to have control over the means of production. No, you want to let people explore their own ways of life, come to their own judgments, develop the capacity to become competent judges. And when you do that, everyone's better off, everyone's happier. So it seems like he's almost squared the circle here, right? He's gotten the goods of Marx and Engels' account of human creativity and the bads of alienation. He's gotten the goods of Kant's account of dignity and so our worth beyond price. But he hasn't sacrificed the power of consequentialist reasoning. When the chips are down, we have to make a decision, and there's no good one. They're all horrible, but you got to act, or because not acting is also an act. And we need some story that gives us guidance there, some moral vocabulary. So it's a powerful view, and I think there's a lot to it.